Well, operators, it's that time again. With the 2026 Six Invitational a little over a fortnight away, we now have an opportunity to look at the 20 teams that have qualified to the biggest tournament of the year. And this year, we're going to change the order up a little bit based on when the last chance qualifiers wrapped up, which means we're kicking off with the Europe and MENA League. And this has probably been one of the most top-heavy seasons we've had out of Europe for a long time. The top three teams out of Europe were utterly dominant throughout, not just domestically, but internationally as well. Appearing in the playoff bracket of every S-tier tournament of the year, top three in the EML domestic standings and regional finals, this three-horse race turned out incredibly close. And they were kilometers ahead of everyone else. No one could even touch them outside of the EML. So do they have what it takes to lift the hammer on home soil? Let's begin with a team that won the EML regional finals, Team Falcons. And already I'm more than a little concerned. Don't believe me? Just watch this. Back when this roster was under the BDS banner, Shaiko, Bride, Likafak, Users, and Solotov were odds-on favorites to win the Sixth Invitational in Boston last year, even though they had lost both major grand finals in 2024 to Beast Coast and the new W7M roster respectively. And despite a dominant showing in the upper bracket, they would ultimately fall short of the final hurdle for the third time in a row. In hindsight, the rumors floating around that BDS, the org, were looking to release the roster after SI probably didn't help them all that much. And unfortunately, that turned out to be the case. But they would find a new home at Team Falcons. I had mixed feelings about that signing, but that's history at this point. Time for the new season, starting with Reload, the 2025 seasonal kickoff event that was also the debut for Siege X. The unique format for Reload meant the final group stage rankings weren't necessarily indicative of what to expect in the new season, so I'm not going to take too much stock in those results. Except for the fact that the Falcons did make it out of the group stage, only to be eliminated in the quarterfinals by W7M. Not the best first outing for your new organization, but this was a showcase event, so no harm done there. That would come during Stage 1. Their first match of Stage 1 was against Russian squad Virtus Pro, who they lost to badly. A 7-2 loss by the runners-up of the last six invitationals, not a good way to start off the new season. But the Falcons would bounce back and go on a 6-game winning streak. No one could even get close to the Falcons. They were unstoppable. Until Wild put their streak to an end convincingly. And they were round out the group stage with an 8-7 loss to G2, and missed out on that upper bracket bye in the process. Sweeping Gen G aside in a dominant 2-0, Falcons themselves would get sent down to the lower bracket by Team Secret. Faced with the prospect of missing out on the Esports World Cup, the Falcons would sweep through the lower bracket of their lives. Matchco, VP, a revenge match against Team Secret, all were pushed to the wayside. And even though they lost the grand final to G2, Falcons did keep it close for the most part, only falling away in the final map. Falcons were looking unstoppable. That is, until they hit a solid steel wall at EWC and lost 2 games in a row without even making a dent. Losing to the EML compatriot and Secret in the upper bracket of their group stage, and then they were sent packing 2-0 in the lower bracket against Space Station Gaming. Let me just repeat that so you understand. Team Falcons got eliminated from their own tournament in effectively dead last. The jokes kind of write themselves there. Despite their shambolic display at their home tourney, Falcons would bounce back and win the first 2 games of Stage 2, only to fall short in Round 3 against, surprisingly, Wild. This ragtag roster was the only team to consistently get the better of the supposed super team. What does that tell you? Falcons would go on to win the remaining matches of their group stage and take the top spot in groups, despite winning in overtime 3 separate times and G2 having the same amount of points. Starting in the second round of the upper bracket, they would get a bit of a scare from their old organization in BDS before overcoming the fledgling roster 2-1. After taking the long way to the grand final, they would rematch against Secret from the upper bracket final and get the last laugh in a nail-biting 2-1. Heading to Munich as the top seed from the EML, Falcons had possibly one of the easiest paths to playoffs since the Swiss format was introduced to the majors back in 2023. The only real challenge was Shopify Rebellion pushing them to overtime in round 1. The rest of the group stage was just them cruising. 7-2 over D+, and 2-0 over W7M. And they were hardly sweating in those games. Falcons start in the second round of the upper bracket thanks to them being in the top 2 from the group stage, and they match up against G2, who we'll get to next. After a thrilling 2-1 win, the French super team faced reigning world champions FaZe Clan and sent them down to the lower bracket 2-1, setting up an enticing showdown against M80. They looked set to finally win a LAN trophy. They were the favorites to win. But for the 4th time in a bloody row, Falcons would lose the grand final of a major they should have won. Following this embarrassment, Falcons would go on to win the EML regional finals with an almost flawless bracket run. The only map they dropped was in the upper bracket final against G2. This kind of sums up this roster, really. Easily the best and most consistent roster we've seen coming out of Europe within the last few years, and yet they've got nothing tangible to show for it. And I feel this is where the real weakness of Falcons comes into play, whether they know it or not. And it's this. They don't know how to handle pressure, and I mean real pressure. They have an amazing run in these LAN tournaments. They barely break a sweat in groups, and they've never lost a match in a playoff bracket. They've lost maps before, but never a proper match. But then we get to Championship Sunday, and they fall apart at the last hurdle because they've never been properly tested at that tournament. And I can't help but feel like it's going to happen again, or worse, at Paris, especially when you consider this is essentially home soil for this roster. Now, don't get me wrong, I love this roster and what they've managed to accomplish within the EML. But being good within a region and almost international champions, that's not good enough anymore. There's going to be an extra level of scrutiny on them this time out. And I don't know if they have it in them to pass this particular test and finally lift the hammer as a World Championship roster. I can't help but suspect these guys have hit their peak, and I've got no other gear to go up to. Speaking of World Champions, G2 had a much better season than their 2024 campaign, mainly down to the fact they didn't need the LCQ to qualify to either the Munich Major, because there wasn't one this time out, or the 6th Invitational this time out. And that's largely thanks to their brand new pickup, a first from his home region too. But we start with their 2025 SI run, which was less than stellar. First seed out of Group A with a flawless group stage, they looked set to take the upper bracket by storm. And then they would essentially bomb out of the tournament in straight sets, losing to SSG and Oxygen in that order. In G2's defense, they weren't the only top-seeded team to be eliminated in the second round of the lower bracket of that year's SI. Things only seemed to get worse for the storied organization when they failed to make the quarterfinals of Reload. Even though it was only a showcase event with no real stakes on the line, it was still a step backwards for G2. Something had to give. So, after benching Uno, the bosses at G2 decided to do something radical. Normally, what happens in the player market is players get imported over to the US to play in the NAL. Citizen, Benjamaster, Nafe, and Spoit are all just a couple of examples of players ported from other regions to play for NAL teams. But never has a player from North America been exported to another region before. Until now, when G2 decided to sign M80X Prodigy and graduate from the Jinxie class, Stompin'. And his signing went down a storm on social media. But the new jewel in the G2 crown's first real test was stage 1 of the EML. And you know what? Stompin' actually did pretty damn well for his rookie stage. Oh, and his new teammates did pretty well too. Now consisting of Stompin', Alamel, Doki, Blaz, and Loira, G2 would go on to have a near undefeated group stage and finishing first. Their only blemish was an overtime loss to BDS's new roster. Playoffs is where they really held their dominance, with an unbeaten run in the upper bracket, beating VP, Secret, and Falcons in that order to claim the top spot for EML going to the EWC. During groups at Riyadh, G2 would secure their spot in the playoff bracket, despite losing to Shopify Rebellion in the second round of the upper bracket. Despite some close wins against NIP and Furia, they would ultimately fall away against Team Secret in the grand final. I will say this, winning EWC as a rookie would have been one hell of a way for Stompin' to end his Pro League debut stage, especially after getting an ace clutch on map 3 of the grand final. With stage 2 having major qualifications on the line, G2 returned to the EML and continued their solid form during groups with second place, once again tying with Falcons on points and losing out to them on round counts. Starting from the upper bracket semifinals, G2 looked to repeat their upper bracket run from stage 1. However, Secret had other ideas. Now in the lower bracket, and faced with the prospect of missing out of Munich, they dug deep and fought their way to the major with wins against Gen.G and BDS respectively. While they couldn't quite get it done in the lower bracket final against Team Falcons, G2 weathered the storm and punched their tickets to the Munich major as the third seed out of the EML. The group stage, while not smooth sailing, did give us some real highlights for us to sink into, including one of the most disgusting clutches of the year.
Although for Doki is still available over towards Secretary. He's got it in hand, he throws it out, but it doesn't connect. And up close, a shotgun Sharif though gets the double, and Didi will get the plant down.
Oh, stomping. Oh my god!
It is magical!
Oh my, that's the most insane thing I've ever seen in my life.
It was so good, even his teammates couldn't believe it. Because they had the best finish in the 3-2 poll, G2 got to start in the upper bracket, and they made the most of it by sending EWC champions Team Secret down to the lower bracket. But an expectedly dominant Falcons and an unexpectedly potent wildcard roster ended G2's Munich major run. However, they had already qualified for SI at that point, so job done. And that position was further reinforced with them being runners-up at the EML finals. Oh, and add another one to the stop and highlight reel.
He currently sits at Doom, getting one back himself, and it feels like the Stomping and Loira is what play. Stop it, man! Every damn time they were in a 5v2, and it's come down to a 2v1. Now a 1v1. Please, I can't be arsed anymore. I can't be arsed anymore!
As much as we may glaze G2's newest sensation, it's not unwarranted. Stompin is just that fucking good. We're talking spoit levels of hype around this kid. His mechanical skill alone is just that insane. And he's got the brain to match. And I get the funny feeling this is not his peak. Wait until Doki and the rest of G2 are done molding him into shape. I suspect he may end up becoming the next Bolo. And that's not hyperbole either. He has almost single-handedly elevated G2 back to where we saw them at SI 2023, where they won their last World Championship. But do I think this roster can win another hammer? I doubt it. They're way better than they were last year, but I still don't have high hopes for G2 this time out. Give it 12 months, let's stop and develop as a player, and we'll talk again. Team Secret's 2024 season should have been a monumentous high for the organization, but thanks to their poor showing at SI 2025, it ended up being nothing short of a disaster. Their 2025 campaign was significantly better, with consistent domestic podium placements and even a land trophy to their names. But can this org redeem themselves from last year's failures at Boston? Let's start there, because we need to provide some context for the season that would follow. There's no real way to sugarcoat this, so I'm going to be perfectly blunt. They fell victim to the group of death, which included Kag Osaka. That had to hurt. So much so that Virtue was caught in 4K crying at his desk. Someone then had the balls to take a photo of this team when this was happening and posted it on social media, no less. Following this, Secret decided to drop both Virtue and Ruby and start from scratch for the new season. So they signed on former Wolves player Mowgli and Into the Breach alumni Newers before the start of Reload. And it didn't go all that well, missing out on the playoff bracket by some distance. But again, it was only a showcase event with the format to match. Stage 1 was the real test. And put simply, they didn't disappoint. Secret got second place in the group stage behind G2, and they had a bit of a rocky back end with 2 back-to-back losses before the final round, including an overtime loss to Gen.G. But their win against VP in the final match of groups meant that Secret could still get into the playoffs with some small amount of momentum. Unfortunately, they would only win the upper bracket semifinal match against Team Falcons. After that, they would lose both upper and lower bracket finals against G2 and Falcons respectively. But with that single win, they had qualified for EWC. And this is where they would fire a warning shot across the bow of the EML. Despite a brief scare at the hands of Falcons, who pushed them to overtime in their first match of the group stage, Secret would almost cruise to the playoff bracket with a 7-2 win over W7M. In the playoff bracket, they were utterly flawless on their way to a 3-0 grand final thrashing over fellow EML Team G2, even with some late-game heroics from certain recruits who I've glazed to death already. If the EWC win was not enough of a sign for Secret to be taken seriously, then what they did during Stage 2 really can't be ignored. After losing their first 3 games in groups, including an overtime loss to Fnatic of all teams, if you know, you know, they would bounce back and win their remaining games. However, those first 3 losses meant they had to start at the beginning of the bracket. Wolves, G2, Team Falcons, Secret cleared the upper bracket with little difficulty. However, they would fall short against Falcons in the grand final. Regardless, it was redemption for their poor start in groups, and still qualified to the major in the process. Munich was actually a fairly solid outing for Team Secret, despite a couple of stumbling blocks in the groups. And ironically, they will lose twice to the very same team. The first came during groups, where they would lose in the 2-0 bracket, but they would bounce back and promote themselves to the playoff bracket the very next day by beating Weibo Gaming 2-0. The second came from their loss to G2 in the first round of the upper bracket, sending them down to the lower bracket to face off against Furia for survival. And although they did beat the former world champions convincingly, they would progress no further thanks to the very same team that denied their first attempt to get out of the group stage. That team was, of course, the eventual major champions, M80. And they would round out the year with third place in the EML regional finals, falling to G2 in the lower bracket final 2-0. Aside from last year's abysmal SI run, Team Secret has been on the steady upclimb for the past couple of years, and the EWC championship win was proof positive of that assertion. They've almost gone under the radar with their progress from near obscurity to EML mainstay. Problem is, with the exception of that EWC win, they've never gotten higher than 5th, 6th at any international LAN event for the past 2 years. While I don't believe they've reached the full height of their powers just yet, Paris is going to be the first true test for this roster for 2 key reasons. 1, to redeem themselves from last year's disaster class, and 2, prove that EWC win was no fluke. And if they can get a deep run into the playoff bracket, which they have the potential for, then I'll say they've passed the test. And finally, we come to the team that qualified through the EML Last Chance qualifier. But I have a question for you. In a playoff bracket that consisted of 4 T1 teams, 3 of which were directly invited, 2 T2 squads with organizational backing, and 2 orgless teams, who do you think won it all and earned their spot at Paris? If you said any of the Tier 1 teams or either of the paid Tier 2 teams, then you're wrong. It was actually the orgless Project Zero roster of Flexi, Upor, Skeptic, Groovy, and Oscar that defied the odds and beat all comers to qualify for the 6th Invitational. And this is where I must confess something. My knowledge of the EU T2 circuit is mediocre at best, minimal at worst. Mostly that's down to the fact that I'm on the opposite side of the world and have my own region's T2 scene to focus on. So for the sake of brevity, I'm going to quickly talk about their results and what to expect from PZ going into SI. Starting with their Rainbow Rumble and Southbreach results when they had Quick on the roster, they were just outside making the playoffs for Rumble. Southbreach is where they took a massive leap forward. Flawless in their group, sent down to the lower bracket early, fought their way to the grand final through the lower bracket, and fell short against GK Esports 3-1. Nevertheless, PZ earned a place in the EU T2 Grand Finals, where they would cruise through the upper bracket to the Grand Final, only to fall short against Panahune at the last hurdle. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If not, I apologize. Realizing that they needed some firepower for their last chance at SI, PZ swapped out Quick for another Into the Breach alumnus and Oscar. They practically steamrolled through the competition in their qualifier pool and more or less did the same thing in the LCQ, even putting Virtus Pro to the sword in the upper bracket final and beating Twisted Minds twice. Project Zero heads into Paris, continuing the trend of having at least one orgless roster qualifying through the LCQ, following Raza Company Academy from Boston last year. However, don't expect PZ to repeat Raza's Cinderella run from last year. The competition is a lot more fierce this time out. Having said that, they actually have a unique opportunity to not only play spoiler within their group, but also put forward a case that they deserve to be in Tier 1 next year. They already have a spot in the 2026 EML Challenger Series thanks to their performance in the T2 circuit this season. So regardless of result, this is already going to be a great learning experience for Project Zero. As much as I am glad for a non-Tier 1 roster to be competing at SI this year, I don't believe they can surprise us at all and make a deep run into the bracket. They should just soak up the experience and use it to earn their spot in the EML next year. So the question is, can anyone from Europe actually win SI this year? Personally, I have my doubts. In a vacuum, this looks like a very potent brigade from EML to claim another hammer for themselves. But in reality, because it was such a top-heavy 2025 season, I don't know if they have enough in the tank to make it all the way. They were mostly trading wins with each other throughout both stages, Munich, EWC, and Malta for the regional finals, and they were rarely challenged by the teams below them. Falcons have garnered a consistency that is also a red flag for their own title aspirations. G2 looks strong, but I'm still not completely convinced Stompin is ready for SI in his rookie year. And while Secret have won a trophy this year, SI is a completely different animal. Project Zero feels like the Joker in this particular deck, and they occupy the same space as Makers did for 2021. The fact that they're going to SI is already huge, and any experience they can get from this event is going to make them all the better for it. Just don't expect anything massive from them. But I will say this, you would have to be monumentally stupid to write any of them off, especially if they get assigned to a good group. And with that, we have reached the end of the EML breakdown. Do you think anyone from Europe or MENA can win SI this year? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to get notified for more of my content, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on when my next video drops. The North American League is up next, and I have a little bit more confidence in that region. Until next time, operators, this is your Resident Silverwolf, signing off.